Good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Wednesday, the 26th of February. I'm Douglas MacKenzie, bringing you stories from Scotland and around the world. I'm glad once again to be joined to discuss the stories behind the headlines by Maureen Watt. Maureen, as most of you will know, had a long career as an MSP in North East constituencies, was a minister in the Scottish Government with responsibilities for education and skills, and for the past year has been president of the SNP. Welcome back, Maureen.
Evening, Douglas. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We start the programme, as we start all our news programmes, with the latest from Ukraine. On this day, 1099 since the Russian invasion of the country. Calls are growing for hundreds of billions in Russian government wealth frozen in the international banking system to be used in full for Ukraine's defence. Europe and the G7 have found ways to use interest from the financial assets to help Ukraine in the war, but the capital has remained locked up since the February 2022 invasion. UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy said on Tuesday, "Europe has to act quickly, and I believe we should move from freezing assets to seizing assets. It's not an issue on which any government can act alone. We must act with European allies." Petr Fiala, the Czech PM, also said the West should use the money to finance military supplies for Ukraine. European leaders have so far failed to reach agreement on how to seize the money without facing legal challenges or setting a problematic international precedent. Ukraine received 500,000 artillery shells bought outside Europe in 2024 under an initiative run by the Czech Republic, said its Prime Minister Petr Fiala. Overall, the Czechs coordinated the supply of about 1.5 million shells in total in 2024. 18 countries, including Canada, Germany and Portugal, collected about $1.8 billion by June 2024 to buy 155mm shells under the banner of the Czech Ammunition Initiative. The Czechs continued to send tens of thousands of shells a month. It marks an improvement from a European effort to send Ukraine 1 million shells by March 2024. That stretched out to December 2024 because of production shortages. Moscow has dismissed Donald Trump's claim that Russia would accept European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer said that after he returns from seeing Donald Trump at the White House on Thursday, "I'm hosting a number of countries at the weekend for us to continue to discuss how we go forward together as allies in light of the situation that we face." The cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine after 3 years of Russia's full-scale invasion will be $524 billion over the next decade, according to a report released by the Government of Ukraine, the World Bank Group, the European Commission and the United Nations. A Russian drone attack injured a 19-year-old woman and set a house on fire in Kyiv Oblast, said Mykola Kalashnik, the regional governor. The city, the region surrounding it, and the eastern half of Ukraine came under air raid alerts starting on Tuesday night. A Russian attack on the town of Kramatorsk in Ukraine's east on Tuesday killed one person and injured at least 14, including 4 children, Ukrainian National Police said. Russian fire hit a residential district, damaging 17 houses. Kramatorsk, part of the Donetsk region, is about 17 kilometers from the active combat line and remains a constant target of Russian military attacks. A Russian military court sentenced the man to 16 years in jail after he was accused of providing Ukraine with data on a military site near Moscow and preparing attacks, authorities said on Tuesday. Well, Maureen, I expect that much of what affects Ukraine will be determined in Washington. But rather than ask you what Donald Trump is going to do next, which is rather like asking you for Friday's lottery numbers, perhaps we could focus on the plan to seize Russian assets and the difficulty for getting agreement amongst European allies, which for once is not Hungary and Slovakia, but Germany and France being reluctant to do it. What's your view on it and the possibility of it happening?
I think this must be basically because it needs to be legally watertight, and isn't seen to set a precedent which might not be watertight. I think if it had been possible, we would have probably reached an agreement to do it before. So there are clearly really quite a lot of difficulties in this. We are using the money that through the interest on frozen assets. That is obviously generating quite a lot of money, but using the assets themselves is quite a different ballgame, and I don't think has been done before. So it is really important that it is done absolutely properly and legally, and doesn't create a precedent that could, in different circumstances, be used wrongly. I think, if we'd been at the table during European discussions, if we'd been in the EU, it might have been easier. But clearly financial institutions across Europe need to agree on this. Whether it also requires the agreement of financial institutions in other Western countries, I don't know. But I'm not sure that it's an avenue that you want to go down. And why are we going down that route? Continuing to go down that route if a peace agreement is going to be reached soon. There are so many things about that, as you said, knowing what Trump is really up to. The media seem to think that it's all a done deal after Zelensky goes to Washington on Friday. But, I can't see that that's actually possible, because we haven't really heard what the Russian stance on this is and how peacekeeping is going to work. And Friday is going to be a big day when we see and hear exactly what Trump has in mind and what Zelensky is agreeing to on behalf of his country. I have more faith, absolutely more faith, as you might expect, in Zelensky looking after his country's interests long term. I think he's clever and he's got a great team behind him. And obviously he's got advisors in other European countries, as we saw during the round table earlier on this week. But what Trump's up to, I'm really not sure. So I think there's a lot to come out on Friday.
Yes, I suspect it will. It won't be the end of anything, but it might be the start. Well, let's hope so. Next, the Middle East, and at least 48,348 Palestinians have been killed, and 111,761 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October 2024, according to the Gaza Health Authority. Senior doctors and surgeons described the torture, starvation, humiliation and denial of medical care they endured while being held without charge. More than 160 Gazan medics have been held in Israeli prisons amid reports of torture. Israel is continuing its major military operation, which is causing the largest displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank since Israel seized it in 1967. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said on Sunday that evacuated Palestinians would not be able to go back home this year as he sent tanks into the Jenin refugee camp. Palestinians who have lost homes and loved ones over the past month have described Jenin as a, quote, little Gaza because of the scale of destruction, death and displacement. Thousands of Israelis have lined the route of a funeral procession for two small children and their mother who were held hostage and died in captivity in Gaza. The national outpouring of grief for Ariel Kfir and Sheri Bibas came amid reports that a deal had been reached to resume the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, with the handover of more bodies of hostages in return for the release of Palestinians held in Israeli jails, due to take place later today. Gary Lineker, Ruth Negga, Juliet Stevenson and Miriam Margolyes are among 500 film, TV and other media professionals calling on the BBC to reinstate its documentary on children and young people living in Gaza, describing it as an essential piece of journalism. The broadcaster removed Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, from BBC iPlayer, pending a, quote, due diligence exercise, after it emerged that the film's 14-year-old narrator was the son of a deputy agriculture minister in the territory's Hamas-run government. It seems from the news, Maureen, that things have moved from Gaza, where we saw that ridiculous AI-generated picture of Trump and Netanyahu on the beach, to the West Bank, which looks like being Gaza all over again.
Yes, fortunately, I haven't seen the AI-generated resort of Gaza. I've heard about it, but yes, ceasefire to Netanyahu doesn't mean very much, does it? And he's continuing his fight against forces that he sees are enemies, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah. And clearly in the West Bank, he sees that as Hezbollah. So I don't think he is trustworthy in anything that he does. But as long as we continue to see hostages released, even although it's in exchange for a huge number of prisoners, at some point, I don't know how have we reached half of the hostages being released. I don't know what the total number is at the moment. And as you say, Douglas, we read today that Palestinian medics are being held in terrible conditions in Israeli jails. So they need to be released too. So there's a long way to go in this horrible saga. But we have to look at the positives, and so far the ceasefire is holding in Gaza. But as you say, hostilities are continuing against what Israel perceives as its enemies wherever.
Thank you. Another story which I'm afraid will be coming back to time and time again. To Scotland now, and the First Minister says he will convene a gathering on democracy and respect in Scotland. First Minister John Swinney will convene a pivotal gathering of Scottish society to work together and unite Scotland against the, quote, increasingly extreme far right. Representatives from key organisations across Scotland, including churches, trade unions and charities, will be invited to attend a gathering in April alongside the leaders of Scotland's parliamentary parties. Speaking at a press conference at Bute House following the passage of the 2025-26 budget, the First Minister said the new gathering will be an opportunity to renew public trust in politics and unite Scotland in a common cause for democracy and respect. The First Minister said, at the start of the year, I warned that failure to pass the budget would send a signal that Parliament and politics could not deliver. That failure would only serve the interests of an increasingly extreme far right and leave devolution dangerously exposed. But the budget has passed, and a different story can be told. Yesterday's vote demonstrated that partnership and collaboration are possible, and that is something precious, something vitally important in itself. But we must do more. It's time to come together to draw a line in the sand, to set out who we are and what we believe in. The threat from the far right is real, but that leaves me all the more convinced that working together is not only the right choice, but the only choice. That is why I want to share a new initiative to bring Scotland together in common cause. I want us to work together to agree a common approach to asserting the values of our country, to bringing people together and creating a cohesive society where everyone feels at home. It was a mobilisation of mainstream Scotland that delivered our Parliament a quarter of a century ago, and I have no doubt it's only by mobilising mainstream Scotland that we can protect those things we care most about, those things that are most important to us today. I'm sure no one except the extreme far right could find fault in what John Swinney was saying, and even if politicians could get together and perhaps agree to the so-called German firewall against the far right, that would be a step. But feeling a bit cynical this evening, I wonder if the approach of speaking to churches, trade unions and charities is not like in the 19th century, in a word with a minister and the dominie. That these organisations no longer are the opinion formers in Scottish society. That so much comes from social media, and of course, there may be some agreements on what to do about social media come out of this, but it does seem like trying to stick a finger in the dike.
But did you just sit back and do nothing?
Oh, indeed.
That's the alternative. Or so sit back and do nothing and just let the far right just take over. And it's so much more difficult to regain everything once you have a dictatorship, as we are seeing in the Western democracy, reputedly, in the United States. I mean, this is what people are fear. And John Swinney, I haven't read or seen anything of his speech, but you mentioned fear, and that's the big word that I think John Swinney said today, that we have got to get away from people feeling that they live in fear. And, this is, I think, a pivotal moment in Scotland, and it's John Swinney showing real leadership, not just in Scotland, but, maybe in the world. And I hope that, I think it will get coverage, and it certainly got coverage in the 6 o'clock news that I was listening to on the way back home this evening. And I'm sure it will get coverage in other media too. And we need more Western leaders to engage in this type of discourse with their societies. And if you don't do it with the churches and trade unions and charities and other organisations, then who do you do it with? How do you cascade it to more and more people if you don't do it through these kinds of organisations? And, if it gives trade unions a bit more oomph and kick up the backside to, get out and demonstrate against what's happening to their poorer members, then, this is the kind of thing that we need. We need people to actually get up and demonstrate against what's happening, and not just get all their news from, social media and Musk-dominated outlets. And surely this is a good thing. What will I find will be interesting will be the attitude of the Labour and Tory leaders in Scotland, because we've seen in the last few weeks Anna Sarwar kowtowing more to right-wing strategies in a desperate attempt to try and regain some support in Scotland. So this could really be a pivotal moment, and I hope that what emerges from, in the months ahead from these discussions with civic society will produce some fight back, I suppose, if you like, against the fear mongering of the far right.
Okay, that's quite an optimistic response, and I hope that you're right, that it will provoke people to take action rather than just clicking like on their Facebook page. But we shall see. And of course, I mean, everyone with the future of Scotland at heart will wish John Swinney the best in this enterprise. Staying with Scotland now, and the latest GDP figures show that the Scottish economy is growing faster than the UK one. Scotland's economy outperformed the UK in 2024 with a 1.1% growth, surpassing the UK's 0.9% increase, according to recent official data. Figures from the Scottish Government show Scotland's economy expanded by 1.1% last year, driven by a 0.6% growth in December. In contrast, the UK's economy grew by 0.9% over the same period, according to the Office for National Statistics. Despite a flat quarter-on-quarter performance in the final 3 months of 2024, Scotland's overall growth remains positive. The UK economy grew by just 0.1% in the same quarter, following a flat performance in the third quarter. In terms of sector performance, Scottish services grew by 0.2% in the fourth quarter, while production output contracted by 1.1%. This mixed performance reflects ongoing challenges within certain industries, but also highlights areas of strength in services. The Scottish Government has been focusing on investment to further support economic growth. The draft budget for 2025-26 includes measures to increase capital investment in the offshore wind supply chain, with £150 million allocated for this sector. Additionally, a £25 million Just Transition Fund has been set up to support the Grangemouth Industrial Cluster's future. However, concerns remain about the broader economic environment, particularly due to rising energy costs, the ongoing cost of living crisis, and the potential negative impact of increased national insurance employer contributions in the upcoming UK budget. The Scottish Government has expressed fear that many of the key levers for economic growth are still under the control of the UK Government. Yes, Maureen, Kate Forbes was stressing that levers are not under Scotland's control, despite the investment being made in the budget. But again, to take a contrarian view, an opposition politician, well, first of all, the opposition yesterday, the Tories, were saying you need to cut taxes in Scotland because of its dismal economic performance. And then we see today that was totally inaccurate. It wasn't a dismal economic performance. But by tomorrow, they may well change the tune and say, well, you're doing so well because you're part of the union. How would you counter that argument?
Mitigation, the word mitigation. We are spending billions in Scotland mitigating the worst excesses of the previous Tory government and now this Labour government in terms of the two-child cap, winter fuel payments, and other things that have come down the line in the last 15 years of Tory rule and now Labour rule. And if we hadn't had to spend that money on mitigation, then there would have been more money for other things. I mean, one of the things that you didn't mention, Douglas, was the investment in housing. Investment in housing has a great benefit to any economy in terms of providing jobs in the construction industries and then providing people with warm, secure, well-built homes. And, I think that's key. If people are living in a comfortable environment, not worried about their kids getting breathing difficulties and that they are feeling warm, even although, sometimes they're not well fed. But if you're living in a new house, which is well insulated, your heating bills go down hugely. And that, I think, is something that is often not talked about enough. So yes, we're investing in the just transition, and very little has been made in most outlets that I've seen or heard or read in relation to the number of jobs that are now involved in the renewable industries. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands now. So, we have got to, although we'll come on to another story about how some of us don't, some organisations don't see that, but we have got, I think, as a moral duty for subsequent generations to invest in the just transition. And if it's showing growth, then surely that's a good thing. In terms of the growth, I mean, it's very small growth, but, I suppose it's light at the end of a dark tunnel. And if we can keep increasing, even by a few percentage points, the growth, then that leads to more, generates more income for the government and to spend on other things. So it's a good news story.
Indeed, thank you. Now, the UK government's new child poverty strategy has been met with concerns that without scrapping the two-child limit, child poverty will continue to rise across most of the UK. Research by the Resolution Foundation suggests that without significant changes, child poverty is set to rise from 31% at the start of the 2024-2025 UK Parliament to 33% by 2029-2030, leading to 4.6 million children living below the poverty line. The report warns that £3 billion in planned benefit cuts will exacerbate this trend. While there are potential benefits from employment and housing measures, such as an increase in parental employment and holding down rent prices, these measures alone would not be enough to reduce child poverty. Ending the controversial two-child limit and benefit cap would have a more significant impact, potentially lifting 500,000 children out of poverty at a cost of £4.5 billion. This targeted policy would be one of the most effective ways to address child poverty, according to the Foundation. Scaling back to a three-child limit while removing the benefit cap could still help reduce poverty, but with a smaller effect, benefiting around 320,000 children. Further reforms, such as extending free school meals to all universal credit families, would lift an additional 100,000 children out of poverty. Restoring the family element of universal credit and relinking local housing allowance to local rents could reduce poverty by another 140,000 children. If implemented together, these measures could lower child poverty by 900,000 children, bringing the rate to 27% by 2029, the lowest in decades. The cost of these measures would be £8.5 billion, a price comparable to Scotland's child poverty efforts. However, the UK government's failure to act on these recommendations has left child poverty on the rise in most parts of the UK. In contrast, Scotland is the only part of the UK where child poverty is expected to decrease due to the SNP's actions, including the Scottish Child Payment and Best Start grants. Research suggests that Scotland's child poverty rate will fall from 23.7% to 21.8% by 2029, largely due to these efforts. The SNP has called for immediate action from the UK government, including scrapping the two-child limit and benefit cap, as well as matching the Scottish Child Payment across the UK. These measures would lift an estimated 1.2 million children out of poverty. However, SNP representatives argue that UK government policies are still pushing many children in Scotland into poverty, despite the progress made in Scotland. Well, I know calls to reverse the two-child cap is like preaching to the choir in Scotland, but it does seem appalling that 33% of children can be in poverty in the sixth most expensive or profitable country in the world. But Westminster seems deaf to this.
Yeah, Westminster still holds virtually all the economic levers in the UK. but yet seems, as you say, deaf to tackling the inequality of wealth in this country. While the poor get poorer, the wealthy get richer by the hour. And it's just unbelievable to me that a Labour government is unwilling to do anything about this. I mean, I don't know what the wealthy, what hold the wealthy have on Westminster governments, but they just seem totally unwilling to do anything to tackle it. You know, this idea that millionaires are going to, you know, flight and live elsewhere. You know, there are loads of other measures that can be taken to tax wealth other than just talking about millionaires. You know, the top earners are not all millionaires, but they're still very wealthy people. And we've got to find other ways of taxing that wealth so that taxes don't disproportionately always hit the poor. And I'm at a loss as to why, as I say, Westminster won't do anything about this. But the figures that you talk about, you know, are substantial, Douglas. We're talking about 27% of children in the rest of the UK being in poverty, while that figure in Scotland is currently 23.7 and likely to go down to 21.8. Now, that's 1 in 5 children still living in poverty. That is unacceptable, as John Swinney has said, in any civilised society. But the progress that Scotland is managing to make, while still thorough to Westminster, is quite impressive. And, you know, it's been hailed as impressive internationally. So much of it is due to the child payment. But as you say, there are other things that Westminster could be doing to really make a difference here, and they're not. So we're fighting child poverty again with one hand tied behind our backs here in Scotland.
It does seem so, thank you. And speaking about wealthy people, the UK COVID inquiry will examine the controversial multi-million pound PPE contracts linked to Conservative peer Michelle Mone, but this evidence will be heard in private. The inquiry has been investigating the procurement of PPE contracts, including those awarded to PPE MedPro, a company with ties to Mone and her husband Doug Barrowman. The National Crime Agency, NCA, has been probing potential criminal offences related to these contracts since May 2021. However, the NCA has argued that hearing evidence in public could harm its investigation, potentially influencing future criminal proceedings. Mone and Barrowman had denied their connection to PPE MedPro for years, but publicly admitted their involvement in December 2023. Both have denied any criminal wrongdoing. The NCA had requested that all evidence related to PPE MedPro be excluded from the inquiry, a move which was opposed by legal representatives for families who lost loved ones during the crisis. They argued for a fuller examination of the government's procurement process, including its controversial VIP lane for politically connected companies. In her ruling, Lady Hallett, the inquiry chair, acknowledged the potential risks to criminal proceedings if evidence was made public, but decided the evidence would be presented in closed sessions attended by a limited number of journalists. The evidence would only be made public after any criminal proceedings are included. The inquiry will also examine the use of the VIP lane through which PPE MedPro received 2 contracts worth £203 million in 2020. The company was selected as part of emergency procurement measures, and concerns have been raised over the role of political connections in securing the contracts. The public hearings related to procurement are set to begin on the 3rd of March. Probably a conclusion to this which satisfies no one, with it being heard in private, and we don't know if Mrs. Moon or her husband will be giving evidence or if it will all be third party evidence. But are we ever going to get to the bottom of this?
Yeah, you wonder why criminal proceedings have not, either come to saying that a criminal something criminal has happened and it's going to court, or yeah, why that hasn't got a bit further. Oh, to be a fly in the wall, though, or one of the journalists who is allowed into the court here, but obviously what they are allowed to say in any reporting is going to be very nuanced, I suppose, would be the word. But I praise Lady Hallett in taking evidence on this, whether Michelle Moon and Barrowman appear in person or not, and it will lead to a better understanding of what happened during the COVID crisis and how the Tory government did have a VIP lane and exactly how many of their cronies benefited and by how much because of this VIP lane, which we must remember in many cases was a complete and utter disaster. I mean, the allegedly the protective equipment and clothing that Michelle Moon and her company provided was completely and utterly useless. And I think the government is already, is it not, trying to get money back from them because of this. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what does come out. Although we will not be able probably to know exactly until the final report is published.
Yeah, thank you. Maureen mentioned renewables earlier on, and BP has announced it will abandon its green energy goals, increasing its oil and gas investment to $10 billion per year as part of a major strategic shift. The company revealed it will no longer pursue plans to reduce fossil fuel production. Instead, BP will aim to boost its oil output to 2.3 to 2.5 million barrels per day by the end of the decade. This marks a dramatic reversal of the plan outlined 5 years ago by former CEO Bernard Looney, who had committed to reducing oil and gas production and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. BP's decision follows pressure from shareholders, particularly activist hedge fund Elliott Management, which holds a significant stake in the company. The hedge fund is expected to push for substantial changes, including a potential breakup of the company. BP has faced financial challenges, losing nearly a quarter of its market value over the past 2 years, while competitors like Shell and Exxon have seen growth by focusing on increased oil and gas production. The company claims that its shift in strategy reflects a focus on boosting long-term shareholder value. However, critics point out that this approach undermines global climate goals and increases the risk of severe climate impacts. Campaigners from environmental groups argue that prioritizing short-term profits from oil and gas will hinder progress towards renewable energy and exacerbate climate challenges. They also warn that this strategy could pose long-term risks to BP's own shareholders as the renewables sector continues to expand. While BP has made no attempt to hide its intentions and why, it's to boost shareholder value, and we don't care about anything else. What do you make of it?
Yeah, somehow investors are not to be affected by the just transition or by climate change. As long as they're okay, everything's okay. So if your house is flooded or your house goes on fire, if you've got a house in California, as long as your shares are delivering a greater percentage of growth, then everything's okay. Aye, right. It is absolutely pathetic that BP have gone down this way. And what I think is that they forget that there are an increasing number of ethical investors. Clearly, this hedge fund has got no interest in the climate change disasters at all. But there are an increasing number of people who are more ethical in their investments and definitely say that they do not want any of their funds invested in companies that have part of their investments in oil and gas. So I think they're short-sighted. I think BP have lost their way. I heard today, for example, that if BP had set up a separate company for taking forward the renewable interests, they might not be in this position. But I think it's a very bleak day, and maybe there is more behind this. Are there people systematically trying to destroy BP as a company?
An interesting thought. The UK government has announced it will suspend its participation in events hosted by Rwanda and halt aid to the country, citing Rwanda's support for the M23 rebel group in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. The decision follows growing concerns over Rwanda's backing of the M23 group, which has seized key cities in eastern DRC, including Goma and Bukavu. The M23 rebels are fighting for control of the region's valuable mineral resources, and UN experts claim they are supported by approximately 4,000 Rwandan troops. In response to these actions, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, stated it would limit engagement with the Rwandan government, calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and humanitarian access, as well as respect for international law. The UK government will pause high-level attendance at events hosted by Rwanda and suspend financial aid except for assistance aimed at the poorest and most vulnerable. It also announced a review of export licenses for the Rwanda Defence Force and suspended training for Rwandan soldiers. The UK has warned that it may work with international partners to impose further sanctions on Rwanda. The M23 group has stated that it is fighting to protect Tutsis in the DRC from discrimination, but some analysts believe its real aim is to seize power in the DRC's capital, Kinshasa. Rwanda has accused the DRC of recruiting former Hutu fighters responsible for the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, a claim denied by the Congolese government. The situation in eastern DRC remains tense, with ongoing hostilities since the 1994 genocide. The UK government continues to monitor the situation closely and has emphasised the need for a political resolution to the conflict. I think the last time we were on the programme together, Maureen, we were discussing the burning of the prison and the raping of the women by the M23 group. And now we have this, and always, certainly in the back of my mind, is Rwanda is a safe democratic country. That's a place that we can send asylum seekers to.
Yes, apparently so. I'm not clear in my mind exactly what's going on here, although, perhaps it still is a throwback to the terrible genocide of the Tutsis. I mean, DRC is no angel. There is huge corruption, especially around the sale of its assets in the DRC. But that's no excuse for rebels from Rwanda going in and trying to take over the DRC. So, as I said, I think it must be a throwback to the Tutsis. It's interesting, as you say, that the UK government has stepped in here. I wonder if a Tory government would have done the same. As you say, how many people would they have deported to Rwanda by now and have them in these lovely newly built facilities that they built in Rwanda for them? The other thing that crossed my mind, though, Douglas, is I'm sure Rwanda is one of the four each government sends international aid to. So I'm sure in St Andrew's House there'll be officials working on this too, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in that area.
Thank you. Romania now, and the Russia-backed Romanian presidential candidate Călin Georgescu is facing criminal investigation. Romanian prosecutors have launched an investigation into Călin Georgescu, a far-right populist with Moscow ties, after claims of illegal activities linked to his presidential campaign. Georgescu, who rose from obscurity to win the first round of Romania's cancelled presidential election last year, faces accusations of spreading false information, promoting war criminals, and establishing an anti-Semitic group. These allegations were raised after he was stopped by police in Bucharest while on his way to submit his candidacy for a rerun of the election in May. Prosecutors have been questioning him and are investigating a range of offences. The initial presidential election was annulled in December amid suspicions of Russian interference in Georgescu's favour, largely due to his vocal opposition to NATO and support for Russia's stance on Ukraine. Moscow has denied any involvement in the election process. Georgescu, who was previously polling poorly and claimed no campaign spending, faces further scrutiny for his apparent connection to massive social media promotion of his campaign. In addition to the investigation, authorities have raided the homes of 47 individuals linked to Georgescu. They are investigating allegations related to the formation of a fascist or racist organisation, as well as false statements about campaign financing. Georgescu has praised 1930s fascist leaders and Russian President Vladimir Putin, although he has denied any wrongdoing. Romania's Constitutional Court annulled the first-round vote, citing irregularities and suspicions of foreign interference, a decision that has sparked outrage both domestically and internationally. Thousands have protested in Bucharest in support of Georgescu, while prominent figures, including members of the Trump administration, have condemned Romania's judicial actions. Romania's Prime Minister has defended the independence of the judiciary and the necessity of applying the law equally to all individuals. This has actually moved on since this was written, and the prosecutor has placed Georgescu under 60 days of judicial supervision, meaning he can't leave the country, and he has been indicted on several counts on the matters described in the report, rather than on the financial wrongdoing one, which is still being investigated. A more robust approach to a potentially criminal president than we've seen in other countries, especially to the west of us.
Is that wishful thinking, Douglas, on your part? But yeah, I'm not sure I know what to comment on here. Apart from the fact that Romania clearly has evidence of criminal wrongdoing and foreign interference, or because it wouldn't have annulled an election, I don't think, unless they were on pretty solid ground. And if their investigations have further seen that they can bring Ceausescu to court in terms of these criminal allegations, then they clearly have the evidence to back that up. So I think obviously there's more to come out on this story. And you said that there were demonstrations by the far right in support of him, but I think there have been just demonstrations. against what he's doing as well. So clearly there's turmoil in Romania at the moment, which is a pity because it's a beautiful country. But yeah, I mean, it's just evidence, is it not, of Putin and his regime with the collaboration of Trump in countries, in democracies, and disruption and chaos is the word of both their game.
Yeah, very much so. Slight Freudian slip there by you, Maureen. You said Ceausescu rather than Ceausescu, but yes, I mean many of his policies.
Very similar
Many of his
names.
policies
Sorry about that.
echo Francesco, that he wants all food to be produced in Romania, no imports, 51% Romanian ownership of all companies and the like. And I know the report said that there were thousands protesting in his favour in Bucharest today. The videos I saw, it was very hard to see how many there were. I mean, there could have been hundreds rather than thousands. And they did try to block the main route in the centre of the city without much success. So there can't have been that many of them. And as you say, there were many protests against them in the period between the end of the first run of the presidential election and it being annulled. So we'll see how it goes. Our final story tonight at PMQ's, Starmer dismissed concerns over single malt Scotch whiskies reputational damage. At PMQ's today, SNP MP Graham Leadbitter asked Sir Keir Starmer about the UK government's proposals to grant Protected Geographical Indication (PGI) status to English single malt whiskies, which loosens the definition of single malt whisky, which is recognised worldwide as a guarantee of the unique quality of single malt Scotch whisky. In his response, the Prime Minister dismissed the concerns over reputational damage to Scotch whisky. The proposals would see English whiskies operate under a different set of rules from north of the border, where to meet the definition of a single malt, a whisky must be created from malted barley that has been mashed, fermented and distilled at a single site. Under new rules, an English whisky could be described as single malt so long as it is distilled at a single distillery, even if the base liquid is created elsewhere. Commenting, Mr Leadbitter, who represents 1/3 of Scotland's whisky distilleries and is the vice chair of the APPG on Scotch whisky, said, "By refusing to rule out plans to change a well-established dictionary definition that contains a global recognition of the quality of a real Scottish single malt, Sir Keir Starmer is pulling the rug from Scotland's whisky sector." Sir Keir Starmer should listen to the warnings from the industry, the Scottish Government and from those across the political spectrum and immediately scrap these plans, which are an act of sabotage on Scotland's world-class industry. Here in Scotland, we are fortunate to be home to a product recognised around the world for its quality. We should show the same recognition and love for it that the rest of the world does, which is why the SNP will always put Scotch whisky first. It's time the Labour Party did too. He described it there as sabotage, and it's hard to see it as anything else. And the English whisky industry is not going to benefit enormously from having this appellation, whereas the Scottish industry could suffer massively. It just seems like an act of vindictiveness.
Yeah, and you could also see it as another indication of how this Labour Westminster government is trying to destroy Scotland and anything Scottish. I mean, they're already trying to destroy the only refinery that we've got, although belatedly they will argue that that's not the case. They took away 800,000, I think it was, from Edinburgh University for developing AI and put it down to Oxford and Cambridge, the supercomputer, not AI, although what's the difference? Anyway, what I'm trying to say is they're trying to negate any differences between Scotland and England that there might be. Now, you better watch that you're not killing the goose that laid the golden egg, because Scotch whisky and Scottish food and drink in general provide huge amounts of revenue to the Treasury. And if they're going to try and, destroy the unique selling point as well as the PGI for Scotch whisky, then hell mend them, because, as I say, it provides huge revenue for Westminster currently. And, this is one of the reasons why we really need independence, because all that revenue could be coming to an independent Scottish Treasury and used to much greater effect to help the people in Scotland.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'll raise a dram to that. That's it for this evening's Scotland at 7. Thank you to our guest, Maureen Watt. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We raised $20,000 from April to the end of 2024, £16,000 short of our £36,000 target. We had to borrow $12,000 to enable us to pay our bills and survive, but the pressure is still on, and we need to find enough regular donors to give us financial security. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around $2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. And please, donate whatever you can afford. Thank you again to our guest, Maureen Watt, and thank you for watching wherever you are, at home, live or on catch-up. From me, Douglas MacKenzie, good night, and please join us at Scotland at 7 tomorrow night at the same time of 7 o'clock. Goodbye.